authors of all time, Simon Winchester, and his new wonderful book. Before we get going, I'd like to just do quick housekeeping. Bathrooms are in our other building. Please ask for a bathroom key. Turn off your phones or make them silent, please, so that because you're going to have an hour here of just uninterrupted fascination, and I'm excited about that. Before I go on and tell you more about our wonderful author and presenter, I'd like to just remind you that Book Passage participates with Dominican University in a leadership series to which you're all invited. And coming up, we have Isabel Allende, whose new book is coming out in June. The Wind Knows My Name. And she's going to be in conversation with Javier Zamora, who is a young man who wrote a memoir called Solito. This is a wonderful young man who crossed the border essentially by himself at 9 years old. And it's the story of his crossing. And he wound up here in San Rafael and got a scholarship to Branson. So he's a particularly special guy, and we're very pleased that they're going to be together. We also have, I kind of call this Book Passage University. Here we have classes, we have conferences, we've got a mystery writers conference coming up, we've got a travel writers conference coming up, and we also have loads of wonderful classes, including today at 1 o'clock. The amazing Anne Lamott is doing a class on writing, which you can still attend. All you have to do is sign up online, and we have computers here set up for you. It is an online class, and she is going to be spending 3 hours with you, really reviewing all of her tips and tricks and telling you personal stories about her life as a writer. We also have coming up Dave Eggers, James Comey, and David Gran, who wrote The Wonderful Wager. We have Lisa C. coming up for a tea. So keep your eye on bookpassage.com because the events just keep on coming, and it's just a spectacular thing. I mean, for example, yesterday we had an amazing, amazing event with a Pulitzer Prize winner, Hernan Diaz, who wrote Trust. So there are just all these spectacular things that happen here at Book Passage University, okay? So today we have Simon Winchester. Simon is an incredible writer and so acclaimed. New York Times, all the worldwide newspapers love Simon's books, Professor and the Madman, The Map That Changed the World, Land. I mean, I could go on and on. And we're so happy to present his new book with you today. It's a spectacular book, Knowing What We Know. This book is studded with incredibly interesting, fascinating details, vignettes. It's a deep dive into learning. It's a dive into the human mind. And he asks us in this book to sort of ponder what's going on with us as humans, as learners, and as people who connect with each other through knowledge. It's a question about wisdom as well. So with Simon today is our good friend Jonathan. Jonathan is our assistant manager, and he is on our events team. Jonathan is a musical theater lover, particularly Gilbert and Sullivan, and he's also a Jeopardy champion. So we're very impressed with him. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Simon. Welcome both. Jonathan Spencer. Sorry, I forgot to say your last name, Jonathan. This is Muchacho.
This is Muchacho.
Store dog.
One of many store dogs. So welcome, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really loved reading your book, and I think I mentioned to you when we first introduced ourselves backstage that one of the reasons why was I thought that I had a certain commonality with you, and it has to do with how you start your book, which is with the sting of a wasp. And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience right after, but tell us a little bit about the gaining of knowledge from a wasp's sting.
Yes, well, it was 1947. It was late summer, and my father was away soldiering in Palestine, and I was alone, therefore, with my mother in a North London suburb. And she took me shopping with her. We had a pram, one of these enormous British things, and I was sitting on the outer part of it between the handles. And I remember weird things about it. I was wearing shorts and it was hot, summery, hot for England anyway. And she had told me to leave my boots on the steps of the house, and I consequently had bare feet. So she went shopping and chatting away, and then turned round and came back. And I jumped down from the pram, and she told me to put on my boots. And I put on my left boot, but immediately withdrew it with a howl of pain, because in it was some flying creature that had stung me. And the moment I, dissolved into hysteria, and she said wasp, and then ran into the house and got ice and calamine lotion and all these good things. And I remember it principally because it was an unusual thing to happen, but a number of things coalesced eventually, which turned into knowledge, empirically gained knowledge. I now knew what a wasp was, and because my mother explained, had it been a bee, it would have died, and so one gets at least the satisfaction that the game is equal. But a wasp, I still, although later in the book I sort of answer the question, but what is the point of a wasp? I mean, I see they do nothing for anyone, but in fact they do, as it turns out. But so I knew what a wasp was, and I knew what the curative properties of ice and calamine lotion, and I knew about swelling, and I knew about sympathy and how you could work that sympathy to get a bigger slice of cake or whatever to make you feel better. But I also, and most importantly, I suppose, I now knew for the first time left from right, because always from then on, left side of my body was where I had been stung by this ferocious beast. And the only sort of way you can normally tell left from right, apart from your heart being essentially on your left side, is to look at the North Star and know that the sun will set on the left side. Otherwise, how do you explain left and right? So I knew it, and that was the first piece of knowledge that I can with surety say that I gained.
And you also were able to warn others away from wasps. You transmitted the knowledge.
I'm not sure that I would have. I'm not so generous as to do that. No, do touch that creature. It'll be fun. Fun to watch.
Well, the reason I brought it up is that when I was about 4 or 5, I wanted to surprise my grandmother at her home, and I in Connecticut, and I wandered around the back to surprise her. And in so doing, I surprised not just her, but a hive of bees. Oh. And they swarmed around me and stung me in about 7 or 8 or 9 different places, and I, from then on, avoided assiduously all the bees in my life until much later. I never got stung again until my late 20s, just because I was so careful about it. And I learned so many things from it, including a relationship with my grandmother, who was the one who brought out the calamine lotion, brought out the cornstarch and water, and pasted things on me, and she spent the rest of the afternoon with me. It was just one of those learning moments, and I never thought of it as the gaining of knowledge before I read your introduction to the book today. So.
Well, and the funny thing there are two funny things. First of all, wasps actually do have a point, because they make paper, and that's when Kai Lun, the Chinese inventor of paper, did so after watching what wasps produce and the fact that you can draw Chinese characters onto that papery substance about which they make their nests. And also about those two animals, I'm a very keen, or used to be a very keen, beekeeper, and so make honey. So I love bees. Still
Exactly.
sort of hate wasps.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about paper and about Gutenberg and about the things that came out of it. I was always under the impression that papyri and other things were more of the story, but I never knew the wasp connection before. And you talk a great deal about how the transmission of knowledge changed radically when paper came along, obviously, and how it could affect that. And you talk about the Gutenberg press. Is there anything that came out of that just fascinated you from the start?
Well, I mean, there's such a lot to unpack in the whole story of writing, printing, paper. I mean, first of all, writing, the earliest writing system is not Chinese, although one sort of assumes it is. It's actually the cuneiform from Mesopotamia. And that was done with sharpened reeds on semi-hard pieces of clay from the Euphrates or the Tigris muds. So the earliest school, I know this isn't quite answering your question, was excavated in just south of Baghdad, a place called Nippur, in the 1870s. And I find it rather charming, the fact that you see these slabs or pieces of now obviously very hard mud with all the kind of exasperations of a student, a child, and his or her teacher. Well, actually his, because it was only boys that were educated in those days. You see cuneiform representations of animals and birds and plants and things that the children were being taught, and hills and natural features and so forth. But you see them being crossed out by an evidently angry teacher. And also you see shards of broken pieces of clay all put into a big box in the classroom next to a bread oven, which they obligingly had built in the schoolroom, both to keep the children warm during the pretty savage winters in Mesopotamia, but also to feed them. And the thing I rather like about this discovery, and from a bunch of forensic evidence, is that when children had either discarded or broken, or the teacher had been so angry with them, threw the pieces of solidified mud into the box in the middle of the room, a child every week or so would be deputed to take that box down to the riverside, fill it with water, and turn all these shards into a ball of mud, flatten it out into about 7x9 sized tablets, and put them on the wood on the stove to heat overnight, so that the children would have something to write on the next day. So not only was it the fons et origo of teaching, but also of sustainability. That sustainability is not a sort of modish 21st century thing. It was being practiced in Syrian Babylonian times 3,500 years ago. So
recycling.
It's been recycled, exactly. But going on to paper, I mean, yes, you're right about, of course, papyrus and vellum and all these good things, which are still used indeed. They were very much visible at the coronation last Saturday.
Right.
But Kai Lun, this Chinese chap, was ruminating on wasps, because they do produce, however unpleasant and ferocious they may be, these very elaborate nests. And he noticed once he had seen, so the story goes anyway, one of these nests on the ground, and picked up this sort of grey, fibrous, nearly transparent material, that it was possible, using a delicate brush, to paint Chinese characters onto them. So he hung around and watched what wasps did, and they went and gathered little bits of bark and little bits of grass and things, and chewed them up and spat them out effectively, and dried it into this, what one might call, paper. So he thought, why can't I do the same thing? And indeed did, and started producing sheets of paper and wrote things on it, which then became common currency in the court of which he was a member in, 600 BC or something. But then the interesting thing is, moving it on to Gutenberg, it's the Chinese, once again, who started printing. I mean, we arrogantly, conceitedly think it's Gutenberg or Caxton in the 15th century, but in fact the earliest printed document, known as the Diamond Sutra, which is a piece of Buddhist writing, printed with movable type, wooden, not metal, but wooden type, in 897 AD. And it also is to be distributed free, which is, I think, rather interesting, because it brings up a whole raft of possibilities. The idea that in later times, in the 15th century, when Gutenberg and Caxton were printing, they weren't doing it for free at all. They were immediately turning knowledge, on which was printed on with their presses, into a commodity. So the commodification of knowledge is a Western 15th century invention, made in parallel with the invention of the presses on which that knowledge was printed.
Right. And of course, there were limitations with the alphabets, how much easier it was for a Western culture to put together type lines, of lead pressed.
Well, absolutely right, and I do commend. I mean, I know one shouldn't be talking about another book, but Jing Su, who is a Yale professor who was nominated for the Pulitzer last week, has written a book called, I think, Empire of Characters or something, about the complexity of producing printed versions of Chinese text, which is formidably complicated, which is one of the many reasons why Western alphabetized languages are so much more efficient a means of distributing information.
What is some of the most fascinating things you learned about distribution of knowledge from the Greeks and the people they influenced the most? I mean, there's a lot of talk about what in your book about the DIKW pyramid. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, although I desperately don't want to in any great detail because you can get really boring in this. This is a book that I tried not to use the word epistemology more than once. I think it appears once in the book, and all right,
Good
reasonable in the so the two sets of the two acronyms, if you like, related to knowledge, and I just want to dispose of them so quickly because there's so much more interesting things to talk about, are JTB, which is Platonic. It's Plato's, very, very briefly, what is knowledge according to Plato? I mean, there were the three greats, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, in the order of their lives. And Socrates all about ethics, and Plato all about knowledge, and Aristotle all about happiness and things like that. So dealing with Plato and Plato's definition of knowledge, he said it's composed of essentially three things. I can declare this to be a table. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but I could equally say it's a chair or a horse or whatever. So that's not good enough merely to declare something is something. If you, however, say, I honestly and truthfully believe this to the depths of my soul and to the bottom of my heart that this is a table, well, that's sort of getting there. It's knowledge that you believe to be true, but it's not still quite there, according to Plato. Plato said you've got to justify that belief. And so to do that in the case of this object here, you've got to produce pictures of it and films about it and encyclopedia entries about it or whatever to justify it. So the three things, justified true belief, is central to what we call knowledge. So to dispose of that, I mean, there's knowledge who, knowledge why, knowledge how, all sorts of different types of knowledge. DIKW is sort of an extension of that. It's data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, and how each of those play into each other in succession. There's a famous T.S. Eliot play called The Rock. In 1934, he wrote it, in which three lines sort of play into this DIKW nonsense. What is this life we have lost in living? Well, that's fair enough. What is this wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And what is this knowledge we have lost in information? In other words, you can be swamped by information and realize you have no knowledge. You can be swamped with knowledge, which is sort of what this book is about, and risk losing wisdom. So to that extent, I do make a nod to DIKW, but quite honestly, forget it. You've heard it once, just ignore it.
Well,
I wouldn't pass over the first chapter of the book. It's all about that. But there's a lot of Greek in it and stuff.
Well, it lays the ground for what you're going to be
discussing.
It needs to be said.
But
the reason I mention is because you have this wonderful quote from the 17th century scholar Robert Burton a few moments later in your work, in which you talk about having an excess of knowledge or data, even back in the 17th century, in the 1600s.
Yes.
That they're complaining about the same things we are today. I read that and I laughed.
I know, it's an extraordinary quote. I mean, do you want to read it?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to?
I can't even, what page is it on?
What do you want?
I will. It may, I don't know how much time we've got, but thank you. Well, super. I'm going to take my glasses off. But
this is just wonderful.
I hear new news every day. Well, let's just hold this. And these ordinary rumors of war, plagues, fires, inundations, thefts, murders, massacres, meteors, comets, spectrums, prodigies, apparitions of towns taken, cities besieged in France, Germany, Turkey, Persia, Poland, etc., daily musters and preparations and such like, which these tempestuous times afford, battles fought, so many men slain, monomachies, shipwrecks, piracies, sea fights, peace, leagues, stratagems, and fresh alarms, a vast confusion of vows, wishes, actions, edicts, petitions, lawsuits. I mean, it goes on and on.
Yeah, it does. I just burst out laughing when I was reading it. I thought to myself, thank you. It was just one of those moments where I said things always remain the same, and there's so much similarities between us, our pasts and our current days. It just knocked me out. But so let's talk a little bit about learned knowledge and experience. You talked about the wasp gaining experience. What is the story of the Andaman Islands tsunami in 2004?
That's more about, in a way, about transmission of knowledge than Basically, you'll all remember the 26th of December 2004, Boxing Day, we say in Britain, but you Americans, it's just the 26th of December. 4 o'clock in the morning, major fracture of a tectonic plate just north of Sumatra, set in train a huge tsunami which swept all over the Indian Ocean and killed the biggest single catastrophe in all of our lives, I hope. 260,000 people died. It was an amazing, amazing event. Obviously, the pandemic is bigger in numbers, but it was spread over 2.5 years. But that tsunami was monstrous. The Andaman Islands, which are a chain effectively trending north-south in the eastern side of the Bay of Bengal, and are part of the Republic of India, the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands to the south, they're mostly inhabited by immigrants from India, so people from Bengal and Orissa and Tamil Nadu. But at the very north, there are these 3 or 4 islands which are inhabited by indigenous peoples, the Jarawa, the Onge, and the Sentinelese, we call them anyway. And they repudiate most contact with outsiders and very hostile. They just go about their business and have for thousands of years. Well, when on the morning of the 26th of December, they, let's stick to the Sentinelese, were mending their nets or getting their fishing boats ready for the day's work, the sea suddenly had swept out and there was just a mile of empty sand in front of them. They were perplexed, as anyone would be. But they, the elders in their community, remembered what they had been taught as children and which indeed they had taught to the youngsters in their community. And that was a series of songs about what to do if the sea sweeps out, and that is to run for the hills. And as one, the hundreds of people on those islands that ran up through the jungles into the not very impressive hills, but about 400 or 500 feet high, and watched for what would happen next. And what would happen next is this titanic wall of water rushed in, completely inundated the sand, all their boats and their villages, destroyed them all, but killed none of them. Whereas to the south, the migrants from India who had no oral tradition relating to tsunamis, in huge numbers, they died. And so while most of this book, and indeed most of the transmission of knowledge that we know about it because of written records, one sort or another, whether it's cuneiform or Chinese or Western languages, it has to be remembered an awful lot of knowledge is transmitted orally, and it happens still with the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, with many of the Maori communities in Aotearoa and New Zealand, and presumably, until we massacred them, of course, it was the Cherokee and the Seminole in this country and the Athabascans and so forth up north. Yeah. So it is an important factor to remember, but I don't dwell on it because it's minimal compared to the transmission of written knowledge, if you like.
Exactly. Well, in your chapter about teaching children, especially, this is the one that kind of touched me the most, was the story about Shukla Bose and her experiment in education in India. So this was in Bangalore, was that right?
Yes, I mean, Shukla is a saintly person and should be known better, and I hope this book will help her on her way. I covered with many other reporters, about a dozen of us, covered the war in 1971 in eastern India that led to the creation of Bangladesh. So the way we covered it was that most of us would stay in the Grand Hotel in Chowringhee in Calcutta and go out to the front each day and watch these really rather ludicrous tank battles going on, where both the Pakistani commander and the Indian commander probably both were classmates at Sandhurst in England. And so I know where he's going to put his tanks because I remember teaching in second year, that kind of thing. Excuse the accent, but I lived in India for a long time and still try and do that. So in the hotel, there was this 18-year-old young woman who called Shukla Bose, or then called Shukla Chakravarti, who looked after us. She was sort of the mother hen, and we all adored her because she was attractive and highly intelligent, and she would just sort of soothe our fevered brows when we came back from the front each evening. And most of the others disappeared, but because I then came back to live in India, I kept in contact with her, and she then married a Mr. Bose, who worked for Colgate-Palmolive in India. And they had a daughter who I became godfather to, and she went ultimately to Cambridge, and she got a PhD in management of coffee plantations and now lives in Mysore dealing with coffee. But her mother, Shukla, climbed up the greasy pole of the Indian business world and became prominent. I mean, she won the Mrs. Gandhi Award for Best Businesswoman in India or something like that. And then in 2003, when she was in her, I suppose, 50s or 60s, decided to give it all up and to devote the rest of her life to the education of indigent children in Bangalore, which is a city in South India, which is sizable, several million people. But it has 800 registered slums. And in those slums, people live in tin shacks or cardboard boxes and have no access to fresh water or electricity or, crucially, education. And she thought this was a monstrous tragedy and she would do something to alleviate it. And so she persuaded two women friends of hers who were teachers, retired teachers, to join her. She got what was called a basati, which is a sort of a hut on top of a flat roof of an apartment building, and said, I will start a school here. And so she set up a trestle table beside one of the nullas, one of these unoxygenated, fetid sort of bodies of water around which these slums are often clustered, and made it known that she would offer to any child that wanted school uniforms, 3 meals a day, and as much education in the English language as the youngster, he or she, could wish for, entirely for nothing, for free. And initially, the slum dwellers were very suspicious, and children would come and they spoke rudimentary English. The mothers would hold, no, I have nothing to do with this. But by the end of the first week, she had got 11 potential students, including one little girl who I think she came to call Jennifer, who came running at the end of the day, just as Shukla was packing away her table and chair, and said, I hear you're offering education. Well, and she was a bright-eyed, lovely little thing, and she said, I want to be a doctor. So she put her on the list, so she had 12. And so she started this education system, and it met a lot of opposition from people who spoke Kannada and Malayalam, the local languages, and said this is wrong to teach in the language of our colonial oppressors. And Shukla would say, no, it's getting on in the world, you have to know English. And she battled and battled and battled, and eventually, well, her situation now is she has 4 schools, 3,000 students. The first graduating class, 6 of them went to Duke University in this country. Jennifer is a doctor. I mean, it's been a stunning success. And so she's now, I'm nearly 80 years old and she's nearly as old as I am, and she's still doing it. And I should say parenthetically, she welcomes people who volunteer and go there, and she'll put you up and just teach, tell them about the outside world, tell them. The last time I was passing through Bangalore, I went and looked in on a class, and they were sort of 5-year-olds, and they said, welcome, Mr. Simon. Tell us, we were talking the names of vegetables yesterday, and the children stood up and said things, carrot or bean or whatever. But then as the conversation went on, these little children were saying the most exotic thing, rutabaga, asparagus, and you thought, bless their little souls. And so the schools are remarkable. And I want her to be recognized. So teaching is hugely important, obviously.
And just as a side, really quick story, that I love the one about the little boy who visited his father in prison.
Oh, that's an extraordinary story. And this is, sort of the reverse way that education you tend to think is one generation teaching a younger generation. But this was the reverse. While I was sitting in Shukla's office one day, the phone rang, and she put her hand over the receiver and said, it's the Commissioner of Prisons of the city of Bangalore. It's often bad news, because a lot of the fathers of these kids have abandoned them ages ago and are often in prison. But she, Shukla, and her teachers, of which there are now several hundred, insist that the children still keep in contact with their families. And if the fathers are in prison, then they will take them once a week or once a month to a prison to meet their fathers, who may be in prison for who knows what, thievery, or in this particular case, he was a gang member and he had murdered some people. So he was a bad, bad man. But the little boy would visit him, and the father would be reluctant. We'd come in shackles, and his hair was filthy and matted and full of lice, and he didn't clean his teeth or didn't wash himself, and the whole thing was distressing. But the little boy and the teacher would. It was evident that the little boy, was improving rapidly and knew all sorts of things, and he all looked neat and tidy in his little blue and yellow school uniform that Shukla's team provided for him. And one day the little boy said, "I'm going to take my father a comb and a toothbrush." Well, initially the father grumpily said, "Oh, what is this?" but took it nonetheless. And then one day when the little boy came, his father had washed and brushed his teeth and combed his hair. And to cut a very long story short, the reason that the Commissioner for Prisons had called that day was to tell Shukla, and therefore the little boy, that his father had won an award for the most improved prisoner of the year and was likely to be on the parole list and probably would be freed.
Isn't that amazing?
It's so sweet. And it's the idea of the upward transmission of knowledge, that mothers would go to the school and say they've learned about men go to Mars, that there's been an expedition to the moon, and you'd tell me about the whatever telescope
amazing.
and so forth.
I just was terribly moved by that story, so I wanted to mention that on. Let's talk about libraries, because I think that's a passion of yours. You talk a lot about the derivation of the library and how it started, how it developed, and you have your own favorite library. Can you tell a little bit about that process?
Yes, I mean, I talk a lot about, obviously, once again, the earliest libraries were in Mesopotamia, and they've been discovered and analyzed, and the first famous library, of course, is in Alexandria, which is why Google Alexa is a homage to Alexandria. But then I talk about the great libraries of the world that I've been to, and the fate that many libraries have suffered, and most notably, I suppose, recently, the utter destruction by the Nazis of most of the libraries in Warsaw, where they had these groups specifically designed to burn down libraries. And there's the Mundaneum, this really weird Belgian library where these two and I can say lunatic Belgians because my mother was Belgian, so she was a bit of a lunatic, but they decided this was the 1880s, 1890s, to put all the knowledge in the world on 3x5 file cards and put them in hundreds and hundreds, which then became thousands and thousands of file cabinets made of oak, and they had to be moved into a palace in central Brussels. And you could ring up for 20 francs, Belgian francs, I think, and say, I need to know something about giraffes. And so worker bees would scurry down endless corridors and pull out the relevant filing cabinet and find some file card, and of course, hopelessly inefficient. And the whole thing died a natural death in the 1930s, but it still exists in an old parking garage in the town of Mons in northern Belgium. And you can go there now. There's some lugubrious old man who curates this enormous amount of file cards, a mad vision of knowledge distribution, which just didn't work. But you talk about my favorite library. I mean, obviously, I'm hugely impressed by the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress and the British Library. But there is this wonderful library, maybe some of you have been to it, in the northwest corner of St. James's Square in London, called the London Library, which is a private library. And you're encouraged to go into the stacks, which are endless. I mean, there are millions upon millions of books. And because of the weight, they're all on solid, well, not solid, actually, that's the point, iron floors with big gaps to reduce the weight of the iron itself. And you can look down floor after floor after floor and see people beavering away, but also, to the distress of many ladies, you can look up a long way. And a distressingly large number of users do, I think. So ladies are advised to wear trousers when you... But the library is sort of mad because the classification system was invented by a man called Hagbert Wright, I think, in the 1890s. And he decided that he would organize the books according to very large basic classifications. So A, anything to do with art. T, books, anything to do with topography and travel. But the one I like most of all is S, which is science and miscellaneous. And in science and miscellaneous, you go out, if you can imagine this, you go up the third floor, and it's the endless corridors with these iron grids, and you switch on the neon light, which illuminates the books on the left and the right. But as you go in at the gable end of each series of shelves, there are the names of the subjects you're going to encounter, organized according to the alphabetical letter of their first of the subject, which, when you think about it, is mad. I mean, to give you an example, if you wanted to learn about caves, why caves is under science, I don't know, but it is. You go to that series of shelves with subjects that begin with C, which include, I think I give a list, cavalry, celibacy, chess, cheese.
Cheese was my favorite.
Cheese, you like cheese, yeah. And it goes on and on and on. So it's a good example. As you go down these corridors and you come to the many, many, many books devoted to caves, but then you notice to the right books on cheese, and you think, well, I've come here to write a book about caves, but on the other hand, this volume on the history of Wensleydale or Stilton or looks more, maybe I'll ring up the publisher and suggest I do a book about cheese instead. So it's mad, and they talk about reorganizing it, but I desperately don't want them to. I hope they don't. But I urge you, it's about £500 a year, and it is just tolerant and club-like, and there are grandfather clocks and leather chairs, and also this incredibly liberal lending policy, which I came across firsthand when I was doing a book about the Pacific Ocean some years ago. And there's a 4-volume Royal Navy survey of the islands of the Pacific, and I could only find 3 of the 4 volumes. So I went down to the issue desk, and the very elderly, very courteous gentleman said, can you look on the computer? And he couldn't. He said, yeah, there should be 4 volumes. Wait a minute, he said, I think I remember. And he went behind the desk and came up with an old sort of shoebox. And in it were a number of 3x5 cards, which did not been taken by the people in Belgium. And he looked at it and he said, as I thought, Mrs. Tomlinson, who lives in Torquay, she's had it out since 1958. And I see from the record, we asked her back 1971, 1979, 1983. So I believe she's still alive, but she's still borrowing books. But I will write to her, Mr. Winchester, and I promise on this occasion I'll be rather firm with her. and she was firm, and I got the book 3 days later.
Let's love that.
I kept him for about 5 years.
There you see. There you go.
Too.
You know, one of the wonderful themes that runs through your book, is, amongst the larger themes, is the wonderful eccentrics who kind of birthed the various forms that you were fascinated by, including Encyclopedia. And I wonder if you talk about the Encyclopedia Britannica a bit.
Yes, although I happily will. I know there is a new book about the Britannica as well, written by another Simon, I think, Garfield. Well, the 3 that started it, and I can never. One of them was called Smelly, but the one who was one of the 2 others who was not called Smelly he was very short. He had bow legs and he had an enormous nose, so he should have been called Smelly. But people looked at him and he said, "Well, if I'm going to be looked at, I'm jolly well going to exaggerate my nose." So he had a even larger nose made of paper mache, which he stuck onto it, and then he rode round Edinburgh on a horse, probably the biggest horse has ever been made, and he had to get up a ladder, this tiny little man, and rode this horse to the office. So in the construction of the Britannica, it was begun by these 3 really strange guys. But and this man, you probably know his name, I don't. But
Bell, I think.
Bell, that's right, you're right. Mr. Bell with the nose and the additional nose and the horse and the ladder and the bow legs and being 4'6". He was a brilliant engraver. And so the extraordinary illustrations which marked early Britannicas out as being something really, truly wonderful last to this day. But the thing about Britannica, and indeed about all printed encyclopedias, of which the London Library has, I think, 960 encyclopedias. So there are a lot of them around, begun, of course, by Frenchman Denis Diderot, or claims, or as the French like to do, but in fact it's German and British, antedated Diderot's encyclopedia. Britannica's the most famous edition is the 11th edition, which was published, I think, in the late 1920s and remained the edition until 1955. and it had a sort of biblical authority. Everyone, that in the English language was the encyclopedia one went to. In my school, the punishment for relatively minor infractions was to copy out entries in capital letters of an entry that the prefect had chosen. And I remember vividly having to write out, and it took days to do it, the entire entry for swan, the bird. And the Britannica entry in the 11th edition was about 4 pages. I mean, more knowledge than you could imagine about swans. But as a result of having to do this, I hate swans. So swans and wasps are quite literally bête noire, even though they're bête blanche. But the thing about Britannica 11 was that, and about printed encyclopedias generally, is that they are a snapshot in time of what the knowledge was perceived to be. And there are a number of entirely inaccurate and fanciful entries. And the most egregious of all, in fact, was so bad that my editor wouldn't have it in the book. And that's the entry for the word Negro. And Negro, which occupies about 11 pages, so it looks very scholarly and detailed, and an analysis largely relates to the work of a man called, I think, Francisco Manetta, who was an Italian anthropologist who lived in Alabama for many years and studied non-white people down there. And his conclusions were so, when written into the encyclopedia, so offensive. I mean, he was a eugenicist, and for a white Italian eugenicist to be let loose on what he thought about the American black person was cringeworthy. So my editor, I think quite wisely, I argued a bit about it and said, you've got to have it in to show the inherent weakness of a printed encyclopedia and the opinions and beliefs of eugenicists. But she said, no, it's particularly in these times, it's just would be a lightning rod. So we took it out, but I commend you. Try and get a copy. You can find it online, I'm sure, very easily. But what this meant was that the translation to electronic encyclopedias, which began effectively about 25 years ago, Jimmy Wales and what's his name, the other fellow, who made Wikipedia. At first, we didn't trust it. We thought it was newfangled. But it's, in my view anyway, nowadays, use it with caution, but nonetheless use it. And I had a weird experience actually when writing this book, because I remember the date quite vividly. 10th of March last year, so 10th of March 22. I'm happily writing about hypertext, the invention of hypertext, which you will know what that is, when the word is in blue or something and you click on it and it leads you to other things. A fundamental building block of the internet, I mean, hugely important. It was invented by this man called Douglas Engelbart from these parts, and the famous mother of all demos in 1968 when he demonstrated it in San Francisco, although he was actually in Palo Alto, connected by a dedicated telephone line, and astonished people. I mean, this was revolutionary to us. It's commonplace, but it was revolutionary back in 68. So I'm writing about Doug Engelbart, and I need to know some basic facts. Where was he born? Where was he educated? And I got all that from Wikipedia, but was terribly distressed to find out that he had died, and not just died, but died on the very day I was writing about him, 10th of March, 2022. So I thought, this is horrible. I mean, God, did I, in some sort of weird way, hasten his passing? And who else have I written about today? And are they well? Should I telephone to make sure they're feeling okay? And but I was puzzled that there were no obits, because even though he may not be hugely familiar to you all, in the technical world, he's very, very sort of saintly figure. So there was no obit, nothing in the New York Times, nothing in Wall Street Journal, nothing in Wired magazine or anything like that. So I was puzzled, and I tweeted about it before I went to bed that night. Doug Engelbart died today, and there's no mention. What gives? And went to bed, went to sleep. And in the morning, there was a long email from New Zealand from a Wikipedia editor who said, don't worry, Mr. Winchester, Doug Engelbart is not dead. He's alive and extremely well, living in Chicago or somewhere. And this is all the work of an Australian hacker who yesterday killed off randomly 10 people. He killed off an ostrich farmer in South Africa, 2 baseball players in Minnesota, and he went on and on and on. None of them is dead, and I have restored them all to life. You'll be pleased to know. So look at Wikipedia, use it, but with caution.
Grain of salt, exactly.
A grain of salt, exactly.
I was going to mention that because it's a lot of your chapter on disinformation and on the misuses and manipulation of the transmission of knowledge was fascinating as well. I mean, you get into the stories about, well, for instance, Bloody Sunday, which you had a certain connection to personally.
Yes, I don't know how much to go on about this, but Bloody Sunday was this event which took place on, I think it was the 31st of January, was it, 1972 in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. And when British soldiers dealing with a more or less peaceful demonstration shot and killed 13 later, one died later, so effectively 14 people. And it became a symbol of British colonial oppression in Ireland and so forth. And I saw it and wrote about it in a fairly passionate way in The Guardian, saying this was disgraceful and horrible event. And I was convinced that none of the 14 who died had been carrying any sort of weapon, any gun, any nail bomb, anything, and they therefore died needlessly. And I wrote that in the paper and was excoriated for it. I was condemned in House of Commons, being a traitorous, typical liberal Guardian writer. And then there was an official inquiry led by the Lord Chief Justice of England, no less, a man called Lord Widgery, which completely exonerated the army, and I sort of fulminated and said, this is monstrous. And then the whole thing blew over. And then 25 years later, Tony Blair wanted to become Prime Minister, and he promised that if he was elected into office, he would reopen an inquiry into the Bloody Sunday massacre, as it's regarded in nationalist Ireland. And true to his word, he did open an inquiry called the Savile Inquiry, which called 900 witnesses or so, of which I was one, a very sort of small fry, but nonetheless. And remember, by now it's sort of 35 years had gone past, and when they ask you in a courtroom with 9 lawyers, a lawyer for the Ministry of Defence, lawyer for the Army, lawyer for the individual paratroopers who had done the shooting, Mr. Winchester, you claim that Joe McGuigan was wearing a brown coat, whereas the evidence suggests he was wearing a grey coat. Your memory, you think, well, anyway, to cut a very long story short, the Savile Inquiry, well, what had happened? By then I was living in Washington, D.C., and the Savile Inquiry was published in about now 15 years ago, I suppose. And The Guardian rang me up because I'm the only reporter that had covered Bloody Sunday who's still alive, extraordinarily. They all died of old age or whatever. Would I like to come over and write about the publication of the Savile report? So, of course, I did. So I flew from New York, where I live, to London, and then caught a flight up to Belfast. And then, just as I had back in 1972, drove a car over to Londonderry. And there were a few old friends of mine, Eamon McCann, now looking as I do, a great deal older. Eamon's lovely to see you. And then they produced the report, and that was an extraordinary moment because David Cameron stood up in the House of Commons saying, we got it all wrong. We had lied. We had distorted information. They had not a single one of the victims had been carrying any weapon at all. The shooting was entirely unjustified, and I, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, would like to apologize, blah, blah, blah. And so it was an amazing event. And I wrote a piece for The Guardian saying, not I was right, see, nothing like that, not taking that tone, but saying, right had triumphed in the end. So I spent that evening with an old reporter friend of mine, and we drove back to Belfast. And I caught I caught an early morning plane back to Kennedy and was back up on the little farm where I live in Western Massachusetts. And a torrent of emails came in from people, including one from a lady. She said, you won't remember me. Her name was, I'm going to forget it for the moment, but let's call her Castle. You won't remember me, but you may remember my late husband, who ministered to your grandparents in Dorset. This, I promise you, this story does have some point to it. She said, I'm now 98. I live alone in a basement in Hampstead in London, but I've known you since you were a child. And I remember thinking you're a truthful little boy. And when you joined The Guardian, I was very proud of you, and we read you every day, my husband and I. And I've now read your piece in this morning's paper, and I think, little Simon was telling the truth 38 years ago, and how nice to see. So you must feel vindicated, but don't get too big-headed about it, because, of course, the people that are really, truly vindicated are the victims and the families, their brothers and mothers and fathers who, at last, after 38 years of propaganda against them, have been proved to have been unnecessarily killed, and how vindicated they must feel in the campaign. But I want to tell you of one other person that was vindicated, and of what you may not know, and that is your grandmother. Because when she came out of her house for several days after the shooting in Londonderry, she was jostled and spat at and cursed and shouted by people who said, how dare you have a grandson who had said such vile things about the British Army, had impugned the reputation of the army. Well, she was terribly distressed. She told no one. She didn't tell her son, my father, obviously didn't tell me. The only person she confided to was my late husband, who prescribed Valium or some medication for her to help her sleep. But I want you to know now that among the people that were vindicated up there, your grandma will be feeling vindicated.
That's a wonderful story. Well, I wanted to, before we get too late into the hour, I wanted to touch on your number one theme, which is will labor-saving devices and the new technologies of information eventually discourage the clever and the intelligent among us from working the brain, getting that muscle going, and how will the effect on our human brains be by the advancing in transmission of knowledge to a high speed?
Well, I think it's a very, very important question, and I suppose I'm guided principally by, many of you will have seen the movie called Wall-E. Wall-E, do you know it? In which the world is abandoned because it's so polluted and filled with garbage, and most humankind now, who is they're sort of bloated, obese people living the rest of their lives in lazy boy chairs, being fed liquid proteins and watching softcore pornography and commercials on flat screen televisions. Could the same things that have happened to their bodies, brought about by Otis and the elevator and Mr. Hoover and the vacuum cleaner and electric toothbrushes and all these things, could that happen to our minds? I mean, after all, since 1967, when Jerry Merriman, lovely name, invented the electronic calculator for Texas Instruments, and we haven't, therefore, in theory, we could put the part of our brains that adds and subtracts and multiplies and divides into cold storage. Similarly, the part of our brain we use for spelling and grammar, that can be put to one side. That dealing with finding our way to Aunt Agatha in Dubuque or sailing from Papeete to Panama, GPS will do that all for us. And knowing things, knowing the atomic weight of sodium or the capital of South Dakota or the names of the principles of the Enlightenment, we don't need to know it because it's all available on Google. Is what's happened to evidently, if you go to a shopping mall in Peoria, you'll see it more than you'll see here, where everyone's sort of fit and buffed and nice looking. Will what's happened to the bodies of people happen to our minds as well? And I, at the end of the day, maybe naively, came out of all this feeling somewhat optimistic. And if I can hark back to the Greeks, because the big three that I mentioned at the beginning, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and add to that Euclid, Pythagoras, and Herodotus, they were very brainy, no doubt about it. But I don't think qualitatively they were any more brainy than the great brains of modern times, Bertrand Russell, Hannah Arendt, Richard Feynman, whoever. But there was one signal difference, that they had so much less to know. They only had one language. Aristotle might have known a second because he spent some long time in Egypt. But they didn't have to know much history because there wasn't much history. They knew very little geography because there wasn't, to them, much beyond the Athenian woods. They certainly didn't know the atomic weight of sodium. They didn't know the capital of South Dakota, because there wasn't a capital of there wasn't a South Dakota. They didn't know what was on anything about quantum mechanics. They didn't know the far side of the moon. Whereas our brains, even the best of our brains, are filled with this kind of knowledge. And I wonder, insofar as one can reasonably say that the big six that I've mentioned, particularly Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, each of their brains could reasonably be called a tabula rasa. It was empty enough that they could ruminate and wonder and contemplate and think great thoughts. That maybe if these mind-saving devices, Jerry Merriman's calculator onwards, if they did the similar thing, imagine using these devices like a faucet, and you hold your brain under it and cleanse it of all this extraneous and strictly unnecessary knowledge, because with no disrespect to the fine people of Pier, why do you need to know the capital of South Dakota? Why pollute your brain with knowing that sodium's 11 and magnesium's 12, or that Descartes or Voltaire or whoever, Rousseau, if all that information is available, then your brain could be cleansed and returned to a state of being each a tabula rasa, which might lead, maybe this is naive, but might lead to a 21st century Plato being born among us, and therefore doing great things, thinking great things for the future of humankind.
Yeah. You go over a very, very wonderfully a list of kind of polymaths from our eras, and even just in our lifetimes. And you said you had a favorite backstage, Frank Ramsey. Did you?
Frank Ramsey. Nobody knows about Frank Ramsey.
I had never heard of him before this.
Wonderful chap who I should probably not repeat the story I told you backstage, but but there is
you on.
Well, it's not that bad, but
it's be prepared.
No, it's not that bad. But Frank Ramsey was chubby, incredibly brainy. I mean, unbelievably brainy at Cambridge in the 1930s, and he was sexually totally naive. I mean, I think a virgin at the time. He said to Mrs. Geoffrey Pike was a professor at Cambridge. I have to gird up my loins for the question, but I mean, it's a simple enough question. He said to her, because he didn't know how to do these things, please, he said, please, can I fuck with you? And she said, what do you think once would make any difference, Geoffrey? Why don't you instead be godfather to my children? And so that's what the relationship was. But the interesting thing about Geoffrey Pike, which interests me slightly more than that story, actually, he was an engineer, and he developed one of the hardest materials known in the modern world, which is known as pykrete. And if you look up in the OED, Pykrete, pykrete, it was an extraordinarily, unexpectedly hard substance, a mixture of ice and wood shavings.
Wow.
And so excited with the Ministry of Defense about this that they seriously contemplated. They built a lot of things out of pykrete, but one of them they were going to build in early parts of World War II, I think, an enormous 2,000 feet long aircraft carrier, which they would tow into the western approaches off the British Isles. And yes, it would melt very slowly, but it would be sufficiently strong and resilient to torpedoes and bullets and artillery shells, and to the tires of landing and taking off aircraft, that it could be used as an aircraft carrier for 2 or 3 years at very little cost.
Oh.
So let's hear it for pykrete.
There we go. Well, before we close out and open up the questions, I wanted to talk a little about AI and ChatGPT, which is obviously came to the fore right at the time you were publishing your book. You do mention it in the latter chapters of there, but in today's Financial Times weekend has a wonderful review of Simon's book, in which the first 2 paragraphs were composed by ChatGPT.
I know, it's so weird. He says very nice things about me, and then says, but I have to declare that I didn't write any of it. That was all written. This description of this fellow was written by ChatGPT. And yeah,
it's coming.
It is
and it's
coming.
terrifying.
It's coming very fast. But what I got it to do, and this is GPT 3.5, so not the 4.0 that Tom Friedman wrote so I'm no great fan of
Mhm.
Tom Friedman. I often think that if bloviating was an Olympic sport, he would win gold. But he wrote this. No, we shouldn't say that. This is not being streamed, is it?
We'll edit that part out.
Tom, you're a great guy.
Great guy.
But no, he wrote about 4.0, and it was an extraordinary column, and it made us all shudder in our shoes. But I using 3.5, I gave it a paragraph of the book and asked it to complete it, and it did. And when my editor saw it, and we put it in a sort of illustrative, as an illustration, she said, "It's pretty good, Simon.
Yeah. This is
Gotta
the
watch
scary
out.
part.
Yes, it's your future looking at you." And then I got it to translate. I gave it the first two lines of Ozymandias, the Shelley poem that begins, "I met a traveller from an antique land who said two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert near them," and then got it to finish it. And if I had time, I would read it, because it is so beautiful.
It's beautiful poetry.
It doesn't have the line.
It doesn't have the best line, though.
my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.
Yeah, I've stood next to that statue,
Have
and I
you
know
really?
those two
right.
things are.
But it's an amazing,
amazing
piece of
experience.
poetry.
Yeah.
It has one grammatical mistake in it. It has a line which says, "I look up at the sea."
Right.
And it is not possible to look up at the sea.
Exactly.
You can only look down or across at the sea. But they assure me that 4.0 has fixed that.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll all still be here in a couple of years. I just wanted to open up the floor to questions if we have a chance. No, we're running on time here. So if anybody has any questions, Deirdre, I think will have pass around a